The notary pressed her embossed seal into the paper with a soft crunch, and Derek smiled at me, the way you might smile at a child who has finally stopped crying. He slid the folder back across the mahogany table, tapped it twice with his knuckle, and said, "There we go, Pops. All done. Nothing to worry about." I nodded slowly, folding my hands on my lap. The notary packed her kit, thanked us both, and let herself out. Derek stood and stretched, rolling his shoulders like a man who had just finished something difficult. He glanced at his phone, already half gone. "Appreciate you being reasonable about this," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Sarah and I will make sure everything's taken care of. You won't have to think about it anymore." I watched him leave, heard the front door close, listened to his car start in the driveway. Then I waited another 10 minutes before I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. The folder Derek had taken contained quitclaim deeds and transfer authorizations, all of them accurate, all of them notarized, none of them mine. He had just signed over his own portfolio to a revocable trust I controlled. That afternoon, I sat in the house I bought 42 years ago and let the stillness settle. The rooms no longer echoed the way they had after Margaret died. The walls had absorbed the quiet, and I had learned to live inside it. I did not need much. I had my routines, my books, the garden out back where I grew tomatoes and basil every summer. I did not think of myself as old, but I had stopped pretending I was not. My daughter Sarah used to visit on Sundays. She would bring pastries from the bakery on Laurel Street and sit at the kitchen table while I made coffee. We would talk about small things, her work at the consulting firm, my plans to repaint the shed, whether the neighbor's oak tree was going to drop branches again this winter. Then she married Derek, and the visits became less frequent. When they did come, Derek came with her, and the air in the house changed. Derek was 34, which made him 12 years younger than Sarah. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no by anyone who mattered. He worked in finance, spoke often about markets and liquidity, and had a habit of resting his hand on Sarah's shoulder in a way that looked affectionate, but felt like ownership. I did not like him, but I did not say so. Sarah seemed happy, or at least committed, and I had learned long ago that you cannot protect your children from their own choices. The trouble began 4 months before the notary visit. I had been in the garage looking for a wrench when Derek walked in and found me staring at the pegboard where my tools hung. I knew the wrench was there, I could see it, but I had paused to decide whether I needed the adjustable or the fixed set, and the pause had stretched long enough that Derek noticed. "You okay, Pops?" he asked, leaning against the door frame. "Fine," I said. I took the adjustable wrench and turned back to the workbench. "You sure? You were just kind of standing there." I was thinking. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when you are pretending to believe someone. "Right. Thinking." A week later, I forgot to return Sarah's call until the next morning. When I did, she sounded concerned. Derek had told her I seemed confused in the garage. She asked if I was eating well, if I was taking my medications, if I had considered setting reminders on my phone. I told her I was fine, that I had simply been distracted. She did not sound convinced. After that, Derek started testing me. Small things at first, he would mention a date and then ask me to repeat it 10 minutes later. He would move items in the kitchen and watch to see if I noticed. Once, he called me from Sarah's phone and pretended to be a contractor asking about a roof repair I had never requested. When I told him I had not hired anyone, he laughed and said, "Just checking, Pops, just checking." I began to see what he was building. It was a narrative, assembled carefully over weeks. The confused old man who could not remember conversations, who lost track of time, who needed someone to step in before he hurt himself or made a terrible mistake. I could have confronted him, but I knew better. Derek was the kind of man who did not retreat when challenged. He doubled down. He made you the problem. So I decided to give him what he wanted. I started leaving cabinets open. I would ask Sarah the same question twice in one visit. I missed a dentist appointment and told Derek I had written it down wrong. He began to look at me differently, not with cruelty exactly, but with the flat patience of someone managing a liability. Sarah noticed too. She started calling more often, asking if I needed help with bills, if I had thought about hiring someone to check in during the week. I told her I was managing, but I let my voice waver just enough to plant doubt. The property became the center of it. The house sat on 2 acres at the edge of town, and the land had appreciated steadily over the decades. Margaret and I had bought it when the area was still mostly farms, and now developers circled every few years with offers that climbed higher each time. I always refused. The house was not an investment. It was the place where I had raised my daughter, buried my wife in the garden under the cherry tree we had planted together, and built a life that meant something. Derek started talking about the property 3 months ago. He framed it as concern. The house was too much for me to maintain, he said. The stairs were a fall risk. The yard was too large. What if something happened and no one found me for days? He suggested I sell, move into a managed community, let him and Sarah handle the proceeds. When I said I was not interested, he smiled and said we would talk about it later when I was thinking more clearly. That phrase, thinking more clearly, as if my refusal was evidence of confusion rather than decision. 2 weeks later, Sarah mentioned that Derek had been researching power of attorney options. She said it gently, like she was asking permission, but the infrastructure was already being built. I knew that if I resisted directly, I would become the obstacle. They would move forward anyway, armed with documentation of my lapses, my missed calls, my open cabinets. So I stopped resisting. I leaned into the role Derek had written for me. I started calling Sarah by her mother's name once or twice per conversation. I left the stove on low after making tea. I asked Derek if he had met my daughter yet, right in front of Sarah. His eyes lit up each time. He was collecting moments, and I was handing them to him. The notary appointment came together quickly after that. Derek told me he had arranged for someone to help me organize my estate documents just to make sure everything was in order. He said it kindly, the way you speak to someone who might forget what you said 5 minutes later. I agreed, without hesitation. Sarah hugged me before they left that night and whispered that she was proud of me for being so open to help. I told her I trusted her. What Derek did not know was that I had been keeping records, every test, every moved item, every patronizing comment. I had a small notebook in my desk drawer where I wrote down dates and details. Derek moved the sugar bowl from the left side of the counter to the right on September 14th. He asked me to repeat his mother's birthday 3 times during one visit on September 21st. He implied I had forgotten a conversation about gutter cleaning that had never happened. I wrote it all down, not because I planned to use it as evidence in some formal proceeding, but because I wanted to be certain. I wanted to know that my read of the situation was accurate, that I was not imagining the pattern. I also started reviewing my financial situation with more care than I had in years. I knew what I owned: the house, the land, a portfolio of bonds and index funds that Margaret and I had built slowly over 3 decades, a small pension from the plant where I had worked as an engineer. It was not wealth in the sense Derek understood wealth, but it was security, and it was mine. I pulled statements, read through old documents, made sure I understood every detail. I wanted no surprises. Then I called Richard Hollis. Richard had handled Margaret's estate when she died, and I trusted him. He was in his 60s, precise and careful, the kind of attorney who built cases with patience rather than theatrics. I explained the situation over the phone. I told him about Derek's tests, the narrative being constructed, the upcoming notary visit. I told him I suspected Derek intended to use the appointment to secure control over my assets, either through power of attorney or by pressuring me to sign transfer documents. Richard listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked, "What do you want to do?" "I want to turn it around," I said. There was a pause. "You want to use the appointment against him?" "Yes. That is not without risk." "I understand." He asked me to come to his office the next day. We met in the afternoon, and I brought my notebook and the financial documents I had gathered. Richard reviewed everything carefully, asking questions about Derek's behavior, the timeline, the specifics of what Sarah knew. He made notes on a yellow legal pad, the kind with narrow blue lines that lawyers favor. "You understand," he said, "that if you pursue this, there will be consequences beyond the legal outcome. Your relationship with your daughter may be damaged." "It is already damaged," I said. "Derek has seen to that. The question is whether I allow it to be damaged further by doing nothing." Richard nodded. Then let us build something that will hold. Over the next week, Richard and I constructed a plan. The core idea was simple. Derek expected me to sign documents transferring control of my property to a family trust, with him and Sarah as co-trustees. What he would actually sign were documents transferring his own investment accounts into a revocable trust that I controlled. The documents would look nearly identical. Same formatting, same legal language, same notary process. The only difference would be the names and account numbers embedded in the text. The plan depended on 3 assumptions. First, that Derek would not read the documents carefully. He would skim, looking for the general shape of what he expected to see. Second, that Derek would bring his own notary, someone who had no prior relationship with me and would simply process the paperwork as instructed. Third, that I could maintain the performance of confusion well enough that Derek would not suspect anything until it was too late. Richard was careful to explain the risks. If Derek noticed the discrepancy before signing, the plan would collapse. If he read the documents after signing and immediately challenged them, we might face accusations of fraud or undue influence. But Richard also pointed out that Derek's own behavior created a defense. He had spent months documenting what he believed to be my cognitive decline. If he now claimed I had tricked him, he would have to explain how a senile old man had managed to execute a complex legal maneuver without his noticing. Men like Derek, Richard said, do not like to admit they have been outmaneuvered, especially not by someone they have publicly dismissed as incompetent. The documents took 3 days to prepare. Richard worked with a paralegal who specialized in trust formation, and together they drafted instruments that were legally sound and indistinguishable in appearance from what Derek would expect. The quitclaim deeds referenced Derek's brokerage accounts and his stake in a real estate partnership. The trust documents named me as grantor and trustee, with Sarah listed as contingent beneficiary upon my death. Everything was precise, everything was lawful, and everything depended on Derek not paying attention. I asked Richard what would happen if Derek simply refused to return the assets after discovering the error. Richard said we would file a motion to enforce the trust documents. The transfers had been made with proper legal process, witnessed and notarized. Derek had signed voluntarily. The court would uphold the transfers unless Derek could prove fraud, and the burden of proof would be on him. What you are doing, Richard said, is creating a negotiating position. Once Derek realizes what he has signed, he will want it reversed. That gives you leverage. You can offer to return his assets in exchange for a binding agreement that he will make no further claims on your estate. He walks away whole, and you walk away protected. And if he refuses, then you keep his assets. The law is on your side. The morning of the appointment, I woke early. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the light change in the backyard. The tomatoes were nearly finished for the season, the last few fruit hanging heavy on the vines. I thought about Margaret, about the years we had spent in this house, about the careful way we had built a life that mattered. She would have understood what I was doing. She had always been the one who saw through people, who knew when someone was performing rather than being genuine. I missed her clarity. Derek arrived at 10. He was dressed in a suit, which was unusual. He wanted the notary to see him as professional, as the responsible party managing a difficult situation. He shook my hand and asked how I was feeling. I told him I was fine, just a little tired. He nodded sympathetically and said the process would not take long. The notary arrived 15 minutes later. She was younger than I expected, perhaps 30, with a calm efficiency that suggested she did this work often. Derek introduced me as his father-in-law and explained that we were executing some estate planning documents. She asked to see my identification. I handed her my driver's license. She examined it, made a note on her pad, and asked if I understood the purpose of the meeting. I said I did. Derek laid the documents on the table. There were 5 in total, each clipped together with a colored tab marking the signature pages. He walked me through them one by one, explaining in simple terms what each document did. He used phrases like making sure everything is protected and keeping things simple for Sarah. I nodded along, occasionally asking a question that sounded confused, but was actually designed to make him explain more, to keep him focused on his performance rather than the text. The notary worked methodically. She confirmed each document, had Derek sign first as the responsible party, then had me sign, then applied her seal. I watched Derek's pen move across the pages, watched him flip to the next signature, line without reading the paragraphs above it. He was confident. He had decided this was done before he walked in the door. When the last seal was pressed, Derek gathered the documents and thanked the notary. She packed her kit and left. Derek stood, stretched, and made his comment about me not having to worry anymore. I watched him leave with the folder containing his own financial future, neatly transferred into my control. I gave him 4 days. I wanted him to feel secure, to believe the matter was settled. On the 5th day, Richard called him. The conversation was brief. Richard identified himself as my attorney and informed Derek that there appeared to be some confusion about the documents executed earlier in the week. He suggested Derek review them with his own counsel. Derek, according to Richard, had sounded irritated but not alarmed. He said he would look into it and call back. The call back came 6 hours later. Derek's attorney, a woman named Lisa Brennan, was on the line with Richard. She was professional but tense. She confirmed that the documents Derek had signed transferred his assets into a trust he did not control. She asked if this had been intentional. Richard said it had. She asked on what grounds. Richard said that Mr. Derek Hayes had voluntarily signed legally binding documents in the presence of a notary, and that all procedures had been followed correctly. She asked if I would agree to reverse the transfers. Richard said I was open to discussing terms. The meeting was scheduled for the following week. It took place in Richard's office, a space with dark wood furniture and bookshelves lined with legal volumes. Derek arrived with Lisa Brennan. Sarah came too, sitting beside Derek but not speaking. Her face was pale, and she would not look at me. Lisa Brennan laid out her position. Her client had signed documents under the belief that he was helping his father-in-law organize his estate. The documents he received were not the documents described to him. This constituted fraud or, at minimum, misrepresentation. She requested that the transfers be reversed immediately. Richard listened, then responded. He pointed out that Derek had selected the notary, set the appointment, and presented the documents. At no point had I made any representations about what the documents contained. Derek had been free to read them before signing. He had chosen not to. Furthermore, Richard continued, Derek had spent the preceding months building a case that I was mentally incompetent. If Derek now claimed I had deceived him, he would need to explain how an incompetent man had orchestrated a complex legal strategy without detection. Derek leaned forward. "You lied," he said, looking at me directly. "I did not," I said. "You pretended to be senile. You decided I was senile. I simply did not argue." Sarah looked at me then, her eyes wet. "Dad, why?" "Because he was trying to take my home. We were trying to help you." "No," I said. "He was trying to help himself." The room went silent. Lisa Brennan made notes on her pad, then looked up. "Mr. Hollis, what are your client's terms for resolving this?" Richard slid a folder across the table. Inside was a settlement agreement. The terms were clear. Derek would sign a binding waiver relinquishing any claim to my estate, now or in the future. He would acknowledge in writing that he had attempted to secure control of my assets through misrepresentation of my mental state. In exchange, I would return his portfolio, minus the legal fees and costs incurred in this matter. If he refused, I would retain his assets, and Richard would file a formal complaint with the state bar regarding Derek's conduct. Lisa reviewed the document. She conferred with Derek in low tones. He shook his head several times, his face tight with anger. She spoke to him quietly, pointing to sections of the agreement, explaining something I could not hear. Finally, Derek nodded. He signed the settlement 3 days later. Sarah did not speak to me for 2 months after that. I did not push. I knew that whatever Derek had told her, it would take time for her to separate his version from the truth. When she finally called, her voice was small. "I did not know," she said. "I know. He told me you were getting worse. He said you needed help." I did not. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Are you angry with me?" "No. I should have known. I should have seen it." "You loved him," I said. "That is not a crime." She came to visit the following Sunday. She brought pastries from the bakery on Laurel Street and sat at the kitchen table while I made coffee. We did not talk about Derek. We talked about small things, her work, the garden, the shed I still needed to repaint. It felt like before, but quieter. And maybe that was better. Derek filed for divorce 6 weeks later. Sarah did not contest it. She moved into an apartment downtown and started seeing a therapist who helped her understand the ways she had been shaped by someone who saw her as a tool rather than a partner. It was slow work, but she was doing it. I was proud of her. I returned Derek's portfolio as agreed, minus the fees. The amount deducted was substantial, nearly 15% of the total, but it covered Richard's work and the costs of the notary, the document preparation, and the mediation. Derek did not protest. He moved to another state shortly after the settlement finalized. I heard through Sarah that he had taken a position with a firm in Texas, where no one knew the story and he could start over. I did not think about him often. The house is still mine. I repainted the shed last spring, a soft gray that Margaret would have liked. The tomatoes came in strong this summer, and I made sauce that I jarred and gave to Sarah. She said it tasted like home. I still keep the notebook in my desk drawer, the one where I recorded Derek's tests and manipulations. Sometimes I flip through it, not out of anger or vindication, but as a reminder of the importance of paying attention. People reveal themselves in small gestures, in the way they move your belongings or phrase their concern. The trick is not to confront them immediately, but to watch and document and wait for the right moment. Richard retired last year. Before he left his practice, he sent me a letter thanking me for the case. He said it had reminded him why he became an attorney, that the law could be a tool for protecting people who were willing to protect themselves. I framed the letter and hung it in my study, next to the photograph of Margaret and me standing in front of the house the day we closed on it. I do not think of myself as a victor in all this. I think of myself as a man who protected what mattered, using the only tools I had. Derek mistook patience for weakness, silence for confusion, and restraint for incapacity. He built a trap for me, and I let him walk into it instead. There's a kind of justice in that, not the theatrical kind you see in movies, but the quiet kind that comes from preparation and precision. Sarah visits most Sundays now. We have rebuilt something, not the relationship we had before Derek, but something new that acknowledges what happened and moves forward anyway. She is stronger now, more careful about who she trusts and why. I see Margaret in her sometimes, in the way she watches people, in the way she asks questions that get to the center of things. The notary's seal is still visible on the settlement agreement, pressed into the paper with that same soft crunch. I keep it in a drawer in my study, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. The world is full of people who will test you, who will look for softness and call it frailty, who will mistake quiet for defeat. The best defense is not to argue or protest, but to understand what they are building and to build something better underneath it. I'm 68 years old, my hands are steady, my mind is clear, and I will not be moved.